Okay, sorry. Oh no. It's going to make me restart Zoom in order to allow me to share my screen. So really sorry, but I'm going to quit and reopen it really quickly and I'll be right back.
Okay.
Oh, come on. Sorry, y'all. There we go. Share screen. Aha. Okay. Hopefully that's showing now, my slides. Sorry for the bit of confusion there. As introduced, I am Dr. Andrew Colombo Dugavito. I'm an assistant professor at the University of North Texas. It is Tuesday evening here, and I know it's morning where you all are, so good morning. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this. Hopefully, I start your Tuesday mornings off well, talking about how we can leverage affinity and autonomy in order to build better opportunities for autistic youth to engage in sport and physical activity. Before I start, I'll start with a few disclaimers. The first is that I will intentionally use identity-first language throughout my presentation. This is done with intention and with respect to the overwhelmingly preferred language of disabled people and those that I work with as participants in my research studies. I know there's lots of different views on this, but I just want to lay out that this is my particular point of view. I also acknowledge that I have bias when it comes to this work. My personal experiences as a scholar, educator, as a disabled person have framed my view, which inevitably have impacted this work. And I truly believe that through honest conversation and reflection, that this work is stronger for having acknowledged such bias. Instead of just assuming that it is an error or an assumption on our part. And lastly, I do have financial conflicts of interest with this work. Some of what I will share today is work that is a part of a book product that could be bought that was published late last year in 2022. And though we often are okay with individuals sharing testing items and work products that they financially can gain from, hopefully it doesn't dissuade you from recognizing the impactfulness, the potential impactfulness of this work. I also want to start with framing my conversation today with you all and root it in ableism. And this is a construct that has become quite prolific, prevalent in the last few years, particularly as self-advocates and other community stakeholders have worked to dismantle many of the items within society that ultimately impact folks with disabilities. Particularly within the US, we often face many societally constructed barriers, such as normativity, intelligence, certain types of excellence or productivity. And ultimately, those are rooted in things like eugenics and misogyny and even anti-Blackness. And these oppressions often are determining who is valuable or worthy based on a number of factors, but particularly when we talk about disability, we're talking about a person's ability to perform, to participate, or to perform at a certain level. And this definition that I use comes from a big disability rights advocate and lawyer here in the United States named T.L. Lewis. And I like this definition because it shows how disabled people can be devalued and discriminated against, just specifically for having a disability, and the stigma that is and surrounds those particular disabilities. And it often rests on an assumption that disabled people, and particularly autistic people, need to be fixed in one form or another. So the studies that I will share with you in a few moments come from that framework, and trying not necessarily to change the autistic person or force them to do or reenact behaviors that may not come naturally to them, but to find their strengths, their affinities, and use those in order to help them better engage in physical activity and sport. Now, I don't know the exact statistics of China, and forgive me for not looking them up, but at least in the US, we know that approximately 1 in 4 people, about 26% of adults, have some form of disability, whether that's a visual impairment and they wear glasses, or they have a hearing impairment, they may need hearing aids, or it's something like autism or a physical disability. We know that in order for individuals to participate in many of the aspects of society, that they have to demonstrate some form of normalcy. That in order for individuals to find sport programs or recreation programs, that in order to be included, they have to fit within the structures and the accommodations and the systems that already exist. And that is often because disability is framed as the problem, and that accommodations are often extra or things because it's a special need, a word that we often use in the United States, that it's something we don't have to do, despite in the US having legislation and laws that reinforce that accommodation and accessibility should be given by any institution that receives federal funds. In 1997, Karen DePaul posited that our current institutions only focus on inclusion for those that fit within our current structures that don't need adaptation. And in the years since, not much has changed. Justin Hagel and several other colleagues of mine have pushed back on the idea of inclusion, and thinking, really, are we creating spaces that are inclusive, that individuals feel welcome or have the autonomy to join or leave at any time they wish? Or are we simply creating integrated settings where folks with disabilities are participating with those without, but they're not really a part of the activity, they're not fully involved, and the person themselves, the disabled person, doesn't feel like they have the autonomy or agency in that particular setting. In a study that came out of the United Kingdom in 2018, Dixon and their colleagues found that 2/3 of people would avoid someone with a disability for fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. And within that same study, they found around 1/3 of disabled people would hide their disability if they could. Meaning they may have anxiety or depression or an intellectual disability, and if they could hide it so people couldn't figure out that they had a disability, they would. And what this really demonstrates is how much stigma exists within our societies about disability, but also how much fear those who don't often engage with the construct of disability really have. We are often taught from a very young age how taboo disability is, that we shouldn't talk about it necessarily. And I can't speak for China, but at least in the US, when children ask about a wheelchair user in a grocery line, in a line at a grocery store, they're often told by parents that we don't ask questions like that. And so without even trying, we inherently are reinforcing that disability is something we don't talk about, that it's something that is put off to the side. And oftentimes, when we even think about diversity broadly, disability happens to be one of the things that is thought about last. Now, before I get too much further along, I want to introduce you a little bit to myself so that you know where I'm coming from and why I think often the way I do. I got started at the University of Michigan, where I did my undergraduate education and taught physical education as a result. So I worked in Michigan and in Colorado, both in the United States, as an elementary physical education teacher. While I was teaching, I got my master's in what at the time was called special physical education, but is now more commonly known to and referred to as adapted physical education. And after doing that for a while, I realized and I got exposed to research. And in my last teaching position, I started to notice how many of the students that I had, particularly the autistic children that I had in my classrooms, often moved very differently from their non-autistic peers. And despite looking physically no different than their peers without autism, these kids were often delayed, or they had very unique ways of moving their body, or specific things like toe walking, which limited certain fundamental motor skills. And that got me started and ultimately led me to doing my doctoral degree at the University of Virginia, studying with both Dr. Martin Block and Dr. Luke Kelly. And in 2017, I finished my PhD, and I've been down in the University of North Texas ever since. While I was at Michigan, I played rugby at the collegiate level and some men's club, although I retired about 10 years ago, and now I do my best to be outdoors and rock climb and mountain bike and hike as much as possible with my partner and our new puppy that we got last year. For those of you who may be using or relying on the closed captions, I just also want to mention that I am a white, cisgendered presenting male with long blonde hair. I'm currently wearing a jean shirt. I've lived in Texas now for 6 years, and it's slowly taking its hold on me. I am standing in my home office, which I share with my artist spouse. And if you're interested, I'm always happy to share her information afterwards. Now, in terms of research, I studied often many different topics at the University of Virginia, though focusing particularly on autism and motor development within schools. And I developed what I considered and what I came from as a pragmatic or a paradigm. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. A paradigm considered pragmatism. Although, and forgive me, the font decided not to show up on this particular computer at home. In the recent years, I've started to really engage with critical work and work that uses disability crypt theory and frames the research and looking in radical paradigms and trying to understand how can we reach a place of equality. And if we only do that pragmatically, we may not ever get there, at least in my lifetime. Now, in terms of the focus of my research, again, I look at systemic barriers that influence movement opportunities and the injustices that exist within those spaces. I really work to collaborate with communities that I do projects with in order to involve them in the research process as co-equal members of research teams. I try to question our collective practice from the classroom to the fitness centers to the community recreation spaces to really understand how can we do better from the top down and the middle out. And ultimately, that has led me to reevaluating how we conceive of sport or movement or wellness and health, and try to center historically marginalized communities, which in the United States, of course, refers to those with disabilities, but also refers to those who exist upon intersections of other marginalized groups, such as those who come from lower income areas, different ethnic or racial backgrounds, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Now, to start our conversation and to delve it a little bit further from ableism, I want to highlight first the medical model. Like many of you, possibly coming into this work, I was really only ever exposed to the medical model of disability, the corrective ways of looking at disability and seeing more or less the person is the problem. So in order to help them achieve a better health or wellness status, we have to change the person. Yet as I continued my education and continued my work, I, of course, eventually found my way to the social model of disability, which put forward by Mike Oliver in 1991, really pushed the idea that although disability certainly isn't all rainbows and good times, that the majority of the disabling part of a disability is not from somebody's impairments, but comes from society. The barriers that exist in the environment, from organizations, certain attitudes that exist, whether they're explicitly said or written down or simply passed through innocuously, just simply by stigma or stereotypes that go unchallenged. I've also started using now what is considered the holistic model of disability. And this is rooted in an idea of justice and participation in emancipatory frameworks that move past the medical model and the social model. And to be fair to Mike Oliver and the social model, he never presented that as this is the only way to look at how to address the social concerns that many individuals with disabilities face. He presented the social model as something that can be used in conjunction with the medical model, that in its place, such as fighting diseases like cancer or cardiorespiratory diseases, certainly the medical model is appropriate there because we want to eradicate those types of diseases. But for many individuals with disabilities, there is no cure, and that is particularly salient for the autistic community. For a number of years in the US and around the world, when autism first came to prevalence and notoriety, much of the rhetoric suggested that we need to find a cure, that we need to stop autism before it ever starts. And in the years since, we've gotten a little better, but we're still working at a few things, mostly because for those autistic individuals who have now grown up and existed in a world where we can name autism, they see autism often differently. And that's not, again, to discount anybody who is facing struggles or issues, but it's to acknowledge that if you were to take away an individual's autism, that often may take away parts of who they are, parts of their own personality, which are all experienced through autism, and you can't separate those two. So in the holistic model, it really tries to say, if we are to reach a place where disabled persons have complete and full equal participation within society and life, then we need to address not just one area, but all of these areas, and in not just one way, but in multiple different ways. So in order to start chipping away at this, I'm going to talk about one of three studies, or the first of 3 studies with you, and that is the grounded theory of adoption and maintenance of physical activity among autistic adults. And I did this with my colleagues, Dr. Blagrave and Dr. Healy. Dr. Blagrave's at the University of California State University in Chico, and Dr. Healy is now at the University of Limerick in Ireland. And in this paper, we were really intent on trying to understand the process in which autistic adults experience physical activity across their lifespan. At the time when we started this study, there hadn't been a lot of work, particularly in adults, even more so focusing on physical activity within adult populations. And I'm a qualitative leaning mixed methodologist as a practitioner. So within this, because we were trying to look for this idea of a process, we decided that a grounded theory analysis would be the most appropriate. And for those of you who may not know grounded theory, it's where the methodology is directly linked with the analysis during the collection of the qualitative data. You're constantly analyzing it. And the idea is to develop a model or a theme that is based in actual data, that is rooted in what people are saying and expressing. And so we used a constant comparative analysis, which started with opened coding, where my colleagues and I each individually openly coded all of our responses. We then had more focused coding, in which we directed and would go back to certain interviews if we found new information and apply it, not just within participants, but across participants. And then it finished with what's considered theoretical coding, in which you look for the relationships and the inner dynamics of all of the codes in which you're constructing. So I'm not going to go through these, they're very small, but this is our list of interview. This was our interview schedule. We had approximately 48 questions. It was a retrospective interview, so some of the adults who were older were thinking back 50 years or so, and we had some 18-year-olds that didn't have to think back quite so far. Excuse me. But between the interviews, they ranged anywhere from about 45 minutes to over 2 hours. We ultimately had 23 autistic adults participate. They were aged between 18 and 65. We did include individuals who did not have a formal diagnosis of autism, recognizing that, particularly within the United States, diagnosis can be very expensive and prohibitive for many individuals. So we accepted self-diagnosis, individuals who believed or were told, but didn't have a formal diagnosis from a doctor, although we used what's called the AQ10, the Autism Quotient Short Edition, just as a confirmatory measure, just to see if those who did self-diagnose, if they would, just based on a quick assessment, qualify for, being considered to have autism. In the colored circles below, you can see breakdowns of, on the far left, where individuals came from. Many came from California, but we had individuals scattered over the rest of the United States, sort of geographically. There were people from Texas, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Michigan, Rhode Island, and we did have 2 individuals who were from the United Kingdom. We had a generally fair split across the age groups, about 6 between the ages of 18 and 24, 4 between 25 and 34, and so on all the way up over 55. Had a fairly even split between males and females. We also allowed individuals to self-express their gender, although no one expressed their gender outside of the typical binary male and female. See, we had most individuals had a college education. Many had at least primary school education. Lots of individuals were self-employed, and many individuals were unemployed. And that includes those who may have had a college education, which is consistent with what we know of many autistic individuals who may have achieved academic success, whether it be a bachelor's or beyond, whether they have graduate degrees, but really struggle to find employment and often have to resort to self-employment. We did have, again, as expected, many individuals who made less than $10,000 in a calendar year, that's US dollars. Although we did have some that made considerably more, who made over $90,000 US, which again is consistent knowing how many individuals are under or unemployed. So as a part of the coding process, we had a total of 29 codes emerge. From that thematic process, we ultimately came to 4 very broad themes, which involve the environment, individual, the sensory experiences, as well as the social relationships. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time going individually through all of these, but I put this up just to show you and to highlight that within each of these different areas, there were both positive and negative aspects. So it wasn't just that any area was particularly always a negative, there could be some positives. So for instance, in the environment, they talked often about how it was loud, or the equipment was too close together, or things like the smell of the cleaning equipment often limited their ability to participate. On the other side, one individual who did surfing, which is not, typically a sport that we would have in many places, right? You have to be geographically in a location that works for you, but it's not what we would typically consider sport, right? Not anything that we necessarily always teach in schools. Things like climbing or hiking or biking can often be recreation experiences that are helpful because they may not necessarily have a strict rule structure, one that individuals, the autistic individual, can change it up a little bit. They can make it work for them, and that was really powerful. Sensory experiences, many were negative, but occasionally there were some that were positive. Individually, many individuals felt they had a lot of competence often, but on the other aspect, things like executive function or the mental capacity, having enough mental energy to plan to go to the gym, particularly when they know it was not going to be a very good sensory experience, that often took away from them going to the gym. And in some instances, individuals would prioritize their own mental health instead of necessarily their physical health, because they knew if they went to the gym that it might take them a day or two just to recover mentally from that experience. And so they really had to weigh the pros and cons. Socially, sort of counter to what many of the narratives are around autism, is many of the individuals that we talked with wanted to work out with others. They often worked out with a sibling or a parent or a significant other or a very good friend. And that would keep them going. It would encourage them to be physically active. And so the experiences that they had socially that were negative were often came from that bullying aspect, or people who just didn't quite understand how to work with an autistic person. So once we got through that coding process, then we did the theoretical coding. And you can see in the photos, we did this very analog where we all wrote down our different themes and codes and started moving them around a table and talking through it. And that was really how we ultimately got to this, which is the model, the theory that we developed from the data. And if you look at it just sort of at a quick glance, most of you, even if you're not autistic, can likely see yourself in this model. And that was kind of purposeful. Autistic individuals are people, right? They are just like anyone else who is non-autistic. And so it's not that surprising that how they select engage with physical activity would be really that radically different from non-autistic peers. Where the differences really came into play were first in the first step in the selection. When individuals were young, caregivers were immensely important in getting them to try new things. There were a lot of individuals that talked about parents who signed them up just to try stuff, even if they didn't necessarily, the kid didn't necessarily want to do it right off the bat. And, you know, there were some trial and error and certainly some things that didn't work. But many times over, if a parent or even a sibling, simply because a sibling goes and plays soccer, for instance, or football, the autistic child would often participate in that sport too, because it's easier for the parent to take two kids to one sport instead of taking them separately. As individuals got older, of course, that importance from the caregiver side became less. However, there was still a social aspect that peers or significant others or siblings often stepped into that role and didn't necessarily force people to try new things, but encourage them to stay active in the activities they may have liked from the beginning. The other aspect is really the participation side. And within that, the environment and sensory factors really were interdynamic. And that part of this theory really needs further examination. I just haven't had the time to go back and do it yet, but I hope others are. So what does this tell us ultimately? Well, first, the environment can be positive and negative. So if you have control of the environment, particularly things like sounds or lights, we can change those to make them more autistic friendly. Doing things that are like an autistic hour of time isn't necessarily enough because that might not fit with their schedules. Social relationships are really, really important. And they can often counterbalance things like the environmental barriers or sensory issues. Supports are important during childhood years, but of course that decreases as kids age into young adults and adults, and with positive experiences. The more positive experiences one had, the more likely they were to continue that activity without having to be prompted or supported necessarily. Competitive activities were a real negative for the group of individuals that we talked with. Around middle school years, which are around ages 9, 10, 11, 12, where sports stop becoming just participating for the fun or being cooperative activities, and they turn into things that are really competitive. And it was when activities became competitive that autistic individuals really checked out at that point. So to finish that one, of course, as practitioners or organizations, teachers, educators, addressing the sensory need, if you do one thing, addressing the sensory need needs to happen before really anything else is addressed. If you're not doing those, and you can't, of course, accommodate for everyone, but using principles through, say, universal design, you can at least try to make it as broadly sensory acceptable for most people, and then work from there. The second study that I'm going to quickly go through was a study I did with a colleague over at the university, or Texas Women's University, just across the street from me here in Texas, by the name of Dr. Susanna Dillon. And we looked at the systemic barriers to sport and leisure for more broadly for disabled persons. And this can be found in a text that I was the lead co-editor for, called Not Playing Around: Intersectional Identities, Media Representation, and the Power of Sport. And if you want this information, I can certainly share it too. So within this project, we started from that idea of ableism exists in lots of places, right? It often is seen as a cause of shame, that disability as a construct, particularly in sport, challenges the perception of a normal body and what a normal, quote unquote, normal body can do. However, in the past, athletes with different disabilities are often defined as supercrip, as something that is additional, that the individual has to fight to overcome their impairment, and they achieved some unlikely success. Ultimately, when we look at inclusion, those who are included are very, very narrow. And as I mentioned at the beginning, often have to fit the structures that already exist. When we look at sport as a vehicle, it often can help navigate what is considered the empire of the normal. And this was a term that came from the work of Dr. Leonard Davis, who examined the United States and ultimately called the US the United States of ability, meaning that you had to be able, you had to be productive, you had to be able-bodied in order to be successful. And we see that within sport. The disabled athletes, through supercrip narratives, often internalize ableism, and within themselves often try to seek a able-bodied ideal. And over the last decade, particularly the Paralympics, but there's been an increase in the media coverage around disability, often a hyper visibility for those with disabilities, which draws great draws great attention to the sport. However, borders often on what is considered inspiration porn, which if you don't know that construct, I suggest you seek out the wonderful TED Talk by Stella Young. There's often an interweaving then too of Paralympic sport and other adapted sports into broader nationalistic views of identity, which often further entrenches those ableist ideas and depictions of individuals who are, as Pullen and colleagues defined, able disabled, meaning they're not quite so disabled as regular disabled people, but they're not able-bodied either. They fall somewhere in the middle. Now, as a part of this thematic metasynthesis, which is akin to a quantitative meta-analysis, we were looking for the patterns that existed broadly across different qualitative studies. We systematically searched the literature looking for articles published between 1990 and 2001. There had to be some sort of physical activity, and it had to come from a first-person narrative, meaning the interview data or whatever data existed within the paper had to be directly from a disabled athlete. It couldn't be a parent's report, because we were seeing, there's lots of those, but those are a proxy, it's a step away. We were really looking for the authentic voice. Ultimately, through our search, we found 31 articles. From there, we pulled out approximately almost 700 individual quotations. Some smaller ones were combined into the others that made sense just for a longer quote. These were independently coded, ultimately resulting in 45 independent codes, and those were reframed into the following 3 themes. And they're quite wordy, and we know that, but we like to refer to them their short version, which is sometimes you got to figure out how to become a second-class citizen, taking a break from pretending to be normal, and they simply can't help but being prejudiced. Now, in that first theme that we had, we saw a lot of barriers that existed, such as cost or lack of opportunity, and even limited physical access. Often the internalized barriers were related to things like shame, simply because they were disabled or they weren't able to do activities the way they used to. And then there was also a loss of dignity, that they sometimes had to ask for help. You know, sometimes athletes who might acquire a disability, it can be really hard, particularly because we train athletes often to be very self-sufficient and not rely on others necessarily. And that I know often comes from a very Western view. But we see it a lot in athletics. You got to buck it up, you got to be tough. Within the social stigmas, we saw things like policing disabled bodies, where able-bodied individuals would tell disabled people what they could or couldn't do, or where they could or couldn't go. And there's often an ignorance of disabled bodies, even by practitioners who were supposed to be working with these individuals. And of course, we also saw bullying, things where individuals were actively treated negatively by peers. Lastly, the idea, the construction that disability does not equal worth was omnipresent. It was throughout many of the studies. In fact, all of the studies that we included. And it was really salient in a quote that came from one of our earlier articles, Audrey and Hansen, in which one participant said, "I don't always feel like a whole person." And that really stood out to us. Now, in this second theme, it's a little bit of the opposite side of the coin from the first theme. So if we think of the first theme as sport often has these barriers, these limitations, this theme is really related to, although, yes, there are those barriers, sport can be a great place for persons with disabilities. It often meant individuals could find community, and they didn't have to be isolated. They didn't have to be a second-class citizen. Sport, for those who acquired disabilities, often helped them transition and work through a lot of the emotional aspects of acquiring a disability. It often gave them perspective and hope that, oh, there's this new thing, right? When they found that new sport, they were able to sort of let go of the perceptions they had or that they felt they lost because they've now gained something new. As suggested by Ellis and Goggin, sport was perceived as a mediator that allowed participants to really navigate the barriers and the structures, the systemic structures that they came up against in terms of accessing physical activity, but just in general life. And that was really poignant in the quote from one participant who had said, "I found nothing until I found swimming. I felt like a complete misfit. When I found swimming, that all changed." And sport really helped people take a break from having to pretend that they didn't have a disability. Going back to the statistic I said at the very beginning about a third of individuals who could hide their disability if they could, many of the individuals in the studies we included had physical impairments. And so they often couldn't hide their disability. And sport often allowed them to see others like themselves, and the disability wasn't quite as prevalent. In the last theme, this really focuses on the field, us as practitioners, as researchers in this area, as scholars and educators, because these samples that we pulled from were very homogeneous, meaning they were particularly singularly focused on white participants, male participants, and those with physical impairments. And often, given that they focused on para-athletes, individuals came from much more affluent backgrounds than those who may be in the broader society. Ultimately, if we are to accept that ableism influences sport, we must accept that it also impacts us as practitioners as well as us as researchers. And though we can easily blame someone for this, it's not that simplistic, as Beacom and colleagues shared in 2016. This is an infinitely complex area with many contested meanings and understandings, and it's likely we all need to do better. But we can't shy away from it. We have to address the issues as they are, because otherwise we're just going to perpetuate the same processes over and over again. And so really, we've told ourselves fallacies regarding disability. We've often centered able-bodied ideals within certain sporting contexts, and perpetuated dishonest definitions of ability, particularly when we try to relate those to autistic individuals. We're often trying to force them into a very normative type of movement instead of allowing them to explore and express movement in their own ways, in ways that they feel successful. Ultimately, we're going to need a culturally respective practice and a transformative practice in order to find a way for sport and disability to exist and coexist in a society where people can access and have the agency within those spaces to feel like they are included. Okay. My last study, and this is where the title for today's presentation comes from, so I saved this one for last. This came from the study that we did, the first study I talked about, the grounded theory. And this one, we looked particularly out at autistic adults' recommendations. And so again, we looked at this through a constructivist lens, meaning we understand that individuals can construct their own realities, and that often experiences are different, which cause differences among those realities. We focused on 4 main items. How can physical activity be improved? How can professionals or teachers do better to improve physical activity for children? How could families better support their child? And how might organizations work to make their spaces more inclusive? The data we got from this inquiry ultimately got separated into 2 broad themes. The first, it's helpful to have someone there to support, was rooted in an understanding, again, in extending our findings from that first study, that autistic individuals really, really want social interaction and social interaction in sport. And that doesn't mean big groups, big loud crowds, because that can certainly be overstimulating for many individuals. But with the individuals they trust and individuals who make them feel like they belong there, that's who they want to do physical activity with, and that's who can ultimately help them become more physically active. Samuel in this particular study said, it's helpful to have someone being there to support. I do it for my girlfriend, staff do it for me. It's helpful to have people that know what's going on and can help you. The second theme we had was, it's that sensory thing, it always is. And this came from a direct quote, but it was the idea just how influential sensory needs can be for autistic individuals. And unless you really address those, anything else that you try to do is not going to be as successful as you hope. And we highlighted this quote from Nicole that said, opening up some sort of gym that's welcoming and conducive to people who have sensory challenges. So instead of walking in and blasting music, maybe just don't have music. And again, I'm not exactly sure how recreation spaces or gyms are in China, but at least here in the United States, anytime that you go to a workout facility, they have music that's blaring over the stereo. Despite people wearing headphones or ear pods or anything like that, we still play music. And so for somebody who's autistic, why even have that music if everybody's listening to their own stuff anyway? So we need to encourage continued learning for practitioners who work with autistic individuals. And that includes ultimately leveraging any social supports that already exist. As we work with individuals and you become more familiar with them, if you work with set individuals over periods of time, looking at those sensory needs and learning about how we can adjust them will go a long way to help include autistic people in whatever setting you're working with. Ultimately, focusing on fixing society first is going to be the best route instead of trying to fix the autistic person. Ultimately, if we focus simply on the person, we're going to lead to poor experiences and ultimately things like masking, which can be very detrimental to autistic people. Gregor and colleagues in 2018 recognized how physical activity among autistic adolescents were just embedded within these infinitely more complex social and contextual situations. And families and the individuals and those around them were hugely influential. And it's ultimately that relationship, not just getting the person to do more physical activity, not getting them to be more skilled in any particular area, but really addressing all of the areas of concern. If parents are struggling at home, or if an individual doesn't live in a space that has access to parks or places that are walkable, it's going to be really hard for a kid to find activity they enjoy. Many of the autistic adults that we talked with in some of the earlier studies really enjoyed doing things in nature, outside, among trees, and in whatever wilderness space they may have had around them. And didn't necessarily have to be like a big national park with huge mountains. It could be the park down the street or around the corner. Ultimately, we're going to have to address all of these different areas of concern in order to ultimately support autistic autonomy. And so to kind of tie everything in together, as we look at disability, it's often absent from conversations, or it's overly visible. But both seek to ultimately erase disability. By not talking about it, we often see disability as something fearful or something that we don't understand. And so interacting with somebody, it may be very difficult because you may perceive their behaviors in a way that they're not necessarily intending. And oftentimes having things hyper visible, portraying disability in a way that is meant to see disability as being overcome or something conquered. This ultimately continues to perpetuate the stigma that exists around disability and autism. We need to include autistic people and disabled people in all aspects of the planning process. They're the experts ultimately in what they are able to do and what they want to do. And so having them a part of that conversation is vitally important. We know how powerful sport can be. It can really, really help individuals navigate systems and structures and broader societies that aren't really built for them. It can, though, perpetuate and reinforce those stigmas that we are trying so hard to fight against. We know autistic adults show interest and want to participate in physical activity, as many individuals are active, but maybe not necessarily in the ways that we as scholars or practitioners define as physical activity or sport. Ultimately, if you're working with individuals, don't assume, ask if you don't know what to do. I know many of us are biased if you work in the areas of kinesiology or physical education or physical activity. Many of us who work in these fields are often biased because we've had great success in physical activity and sport. So we think everybody should do it. But it's really important to recognize that physical activity is just one aspect of a person's day. And sometimes they may need to regulate other aspects that come first before they do physical activity, right? So trying to force them into physical activity when they're not really in a good mental state is not always the best option. Sensory factors are hugely important. So we need to build better physical activity environments, particularly the ones inside. And it would help to have folks with disabilities a part of those conversations. Ultimately, if you can, activities that are more collaborative instead of competitive tend to be more preferred, although that's not universal, right? There are certainly autistic athletes who strive for competition and thrive on those things. But when we talk about sort of the broad majority, favoring collaborative activities is likely going to be more preferred. And with that, I will say thank you and leave you with a photo of my dog Artemis as a puppy. And I will open it now for any questions you have. And I'll leave up the slide for a few minutes just so that if you want to get my contact information, it's there. My personal portfolio is amcd.wtf. I share many of my articles, presentations there. And the only social media I use at the moment is Twitter until it decides to implode. You can find my handle there. I also do a podcast. The link is there. And in September, I did a TED Talk here at the University of North Texas. You can watch it on YouTube at the link. And it covers many of the things I talked about today. So thank you, and any questions?
Thank you for sharing, Professor. Many people are sending me private messages backstage saying that your sharing is very useful and necessary. Can we start the Q&A session now?
Absolutely. I will take this down, and I know you've shared, so shared the slides with everybody. So hopefully, if they need them, feel free to email me.
Okay. Here is question 1. I hope my child can stick to a sport for a long time. I want this sport to be beneficial for their development and social integration. In your opinion, what type of sport should I choose for my child? Here is question 1.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your question. It's hard to know without knowing your child. And if they don't have any preferences at the moment, I'm not sure what age they are, but trying things like swimming can be great activities. Yoga has been very beneficial for individuals. Things like karate or Tai Chi have been also very helpful for individuals. I also know kids who have participated in soccer or football. Kids have also done activities like hiking. And I'd say if your kid's young enough and they're too young to really tell you what they want to do, I would try to expose them to as many things that you can and that they're willing to try. And although finding the perfect sport or sports might be a goal, sometimes it's really important the coaches or the people organizing the event, if they are welcoming and encouraging for your child as well.
Okay, thank you for your answer. 希望这个回答能回到这位听众。然后 here is question 2. This may be a researcher's question. They want to know how you think new technologies such as VR can be used to combine research and physical activity for children with autism, or in your opinion, it's necessary to apply these new technologies for children with autism?
So was that VR is like virtual reality? Is that the?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of promise in a lot of the new technologies, particularly if we can get kids up and moving. I know like the Nintendo Wii was, people thought that was going to be a great big hit to get people up and moving, but the games were never developed really in a way that forced you, to be up and active. I think with VR or other technologies like that, I don't know if we're at a point yet where those can totally replace doing physical activity in a non-virtual world. However, with kids on the autism spectrum, VR or other types of augmented reality can be helpful to prepare somebody for an environment they may be going into. I haven't done this research specifically on my own, but I've seen a few other studies that have shown kids who are taught in a virtual reality setting can transfer that often to the reality, to the non-virtual environment much easier. So for instance, we could use a virtual environment to help a child or an adolescent go to a gym and learn to process or practice where certain equipment is, or how to request a locker or a changing room, or access to the pool, for instance. And that way we can prepare somebody in a more controlled area or controlled environment, and support them so that when we do go to the real thing, that they're a little bit more aware, they're a little bit more ready for that particular environment. I'm kind of a little bit of a person who likes just moving their body, and I've slowly been trying to separate myself from the technical world or technology all the time, leaving my phone in places more often. But I see its utility. And for me personally, I see technology in things like VR or other active type of video games to be used in collaboration with the real thing, with the real environment. So it could be things that are rewarding, that they do it in one activity and you're reinforcing skills in the virtual environment, or vice versa.
Okay, thank you answer. Due to the time constraints, we may not be able to further explore avid questions. 然后呢，我们不能够对于每个问题可能进行深入探讨。Here is the last question.
Okay.
In your research, I have learned that there are many factors that have a negative impact on children with autism. If I want my child to stick to sports as much as possible, what should I avoid doing and what should I focus on strengthening?
Yeah. Thank you again for your question. It's a hard one. And first, I want to commend you that and tell you that you're likely doing all of the right things now. And no matter what you try, it may not always result in the outcome that we hope for. I think in order to support your child as they join in physical activity, listening to what they are wanting to do, and for me, trying to make and keep sport or physical activity as a fun thing, I think is right at the top of the list of the best things that you can do. I know within the US, and again, I'm not as familiar with Chinese culture, but in the US, often autistic kids, many of the things that they do become therapy. So they go to speech therapy, and they go to play therapy, and they go from place to place to place. And rightly so, many parents are anxious, and they want the best for their child and your child. But often, if we make everything therapy, then, therapy is not often fun. So keeping sport fun, making it a family thing, things you enjoy together, finding other parents of kids who are autistic or not autistic, or maybe have other disabilities, finding ways for them to play together and can support each other that way, I think is ultimately going to be the best way to keep them active. Just keeping it fun, because at least in the work that I've done, when things are enjoyable and kids have success, they're ultimately going to stick to those activities in some way, even if it's not exactly the way they start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Many Chinese parents has asked me to express their gratitude to you for sharing such beautiful content. And
Thank you.
非常感谢我们今天这位教授给我们带来的分享。然后呢，我们本次的就是运动的与神经多样性的一个国际高峰会议到今天就结束了。And our lecture for today has come to an end. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. We can end the meeting now.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.